by way of introduction to me, one thing I can say is that I'm the author of this book, Brexit Unfolded, How No One Got What They Wanted and Why They Were Never Going to, which was published last June to coincide with the 5th anniversary of the referendum. And actually, what I had been going to talk about today when Gavin first invited me was to talk about the ways in which Brexit is still unfolding, because the book ends, the book sort of tells the story, if you like, from the day after the referendum result through to the end of the transition period. And so I was going to talk about all the various ways that there are sort of ongoing events still. But in fact, as we got closer to today, I began to think that things have become so sort of overwhelmed by what is happening in Ukraine that I would talk specifically just about that and its interrelationship with Brexit. Now, the other thing that some people may possibly know about me is that I write a blog about Brexit, which comes out weekly, and actually what I'm going to talk about today is very much based on the blog post I wrote on Friday. So those of you who may have read that blog post will have some familiarity with what I'm going to say, but still hopefully it might be of some interest. I'll just talk to say a couple of brief things about the book, which has had sort of quite a good reception, and lots of people have said nice things about it. Jonathan Dimbleby, Sarah Carey, Irish journalist, Caroline Lucas, Howard Goodall, Brian Cox, but it hasn't all been plain sailing, in case you think that it's completely without criticism, because on Amazon this bounced into view, a review from Ferrari Man saying that it's all Remain propaganda, and it's you by all means read it and laugh at it, but don't take it seriously unless you're a hardcore bit of Remainer. So that was nice. But today I want to talk about Ukraine and Brexit, and I think the most important thing to say, I think, is that Brexit is the least important thing to be talking about in relation to Brexit. And I'm, as I think everybody listening to this, listening today, and just everybody generally would know, that there are so many bigger and more important things that are happening in Ukraine. So really, to talk about the implications and the issues around Brexit seems almost wrong. And so that is a kind of a caveat, I hope, to everything that I'm going to say, and I wouldn't want anyone to think that by focusing on Brexit that is a kind of that is sort of myopic or unaware of the tragedies and the horrors, and indeed the terrorism as well, which is unfolding there. So I wanted to just start by making a few general points. Well, that was the first of the general points. That it does, nonetheless have these sort of connections to Brexit. And, I mentioned in the blog post, there's a little bit of hypocrisy flying around, particularly for some Brexiters sort of saying, you shouldn't be going on about Brexit anymore because of what's happening in Ukraine. But, there are also a lot of very prominent Brexit supporters writing about how the UK response to the Ukraine war has in some way sort of vindicated or justified Brexit or something like that. So in that sense, what's sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander, and I don't see any reason why we shouldn't talk about it. But of course, this is also part of a more general sense. The talk was going to be called Brexit Unfolding, and that sense of Brexit as a kind of an ongoing condition, it matters because, of course, particularly as years go by, it's going to become more and more difficult. It is more and more difficult to think about Brexit as being some kind of discrete topic or discrete event. But of course, always inevitably, it impacts on and is impacted by other things that have happened and will continue to happen. The pandemic, until now being the obvious example, perhaps, but that's what then brings us to, in this case, Ukraine and the Ukraine war. And I think another thing, a lot of the discussion, a lot of the debate about Brexit, including the stuff that I've written, has very often been perhaps had economic things at the forefront, of discussion, particularly of the sort of costs, the consequences of Brexit. But it's always been the case, right from the beginning. It was obvious that the Brexit was going to have really significant geopolitical implications in terms of how Britain related to the world, and therefore, in a sense, upon the world as well. And again, that brings us then now to the question of the relationship with Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I just want to say a few sort of preliminary words about Brexit in relation to Russia. And of course, I mean, one thing is that I've seen a few things kicking around in the pro-Brexit press, sort of saying that the Remainers saying, "Oh, Brexit is what led to the Ukraine war, or led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine." I mean, I'm not sure anyone is really saying that, but I mean that's patently not true. And I think anyone who's saying Brexit led to the Ukraine war is really talking nonsense. But I guess what you can sort of see how Brexit that was an aspect of what many people see as this sort of fracturing and damage that has been done to the kind of sort of liberal international order, rules-based international order, including, I mean, the Trump presidency is over, but that clearly had big kinds of impacts on the way people understood what, for example, the US commitment to NATO might be in the future, and some of that has not disappeared simply because of Trump, because of Trump going, and so on and so forth. So in that very general kind of way, you can think perhaps that that the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, which predates the latest invasion, has perhaps to some extent been sort of encouraged by that fracturing, and Brexit was a part of that, but it's at that general kind of level. I think it is worth saying that particularly at the time of the annexation of Crimea, that there were some Brexiters, including Boris Johnson and certainly Nigel Farage, who really sort of sought to make the EU responsible for that, and sort of saying, well, it was the offer of an association agreement from the EU to Ukraine, which in some sense kind of sort of provoked or gave Putin reasons for insecurity or something like that. And I don't think it's unfair to say that there were Brexiters who are pretty much openly apologists and admirers of Putin. I think I don't particularly want to talk about this in detail. I think it's always been difficult to know exactly what we can say about the nature and extent and success of possible Russian interference in the referendum. But I don't think the Ukraine war tells us anything about that one way or the other. But the important thing was to bear in mind, as many people have kind of commented, is that whether or not Putin or Putin's Russia had any role in that, nonetheless, it was an ideal policy from the point of view of Putin, because of a sort of stated intention to undermine and divide the EU, as well as provoking internal divisions within the United Kingdom. So both of those things were we can say at least were to Russia's advantage. And of course, the other kind of general contextual issue is the extent, the massive extent of Russian money which has come into the UK, some of it associated certainly with money laundering and corruption, not all of it, the entanglement of Russian money with the funding of the Tory party, and indeed, potentially, or certainly, questions have sort of been raised about Boris Johnson's personal involvement in that. But again, I would see this as being kind of independent of Brexit, right? In the sense that, certainly it predated Brexit, even if there'd been no Brexit, that it would still have been an issue. But of course, it comes to the fore in a particular way now in relation to the invasion of Ukraine. But the more specific things that I want to talk about are things that we can see around around the sort of linkages and connections between the Ukraine war and Brexit. And one of them, again, clearly not caused by the war, but it seems to me that, that we can say that perhaps Boris Johnson would have become prime minister without Brexit. You know, I mean, we know that he harboured that ambition, and it's pretty plain, or to many people, it's plain that his support for Brexit was really based on the idea that he thought that would be most advantageous to his personal ambitions. So we can't say for sure, but the sort of the approximate reason why Johnson became prime minister in 2019, you know, was because of Brexit and the situation that Brexit had provoked. And in Johnson, I would, this is hardly a unique sort of viewpoint, would say that he is not a leader sort of suited to this crisis. Now, you could say actually in the press in the last kind of few days there have been quite a few attempts in the sort of the pro-Tory and pro-Brexit press to an extent to sort of say that he is being revealed as being a successful leader in this context. I mean, I think on the contrary that it has shown up some of his manifest failings as a leader, and one of them in particular is that he has this constant propensity to make sort of grand statements and grand claims about things that turn out not to be true. And a good example in relation to Ukraine is the claims that he made at Prime Minister's Questions last week about how much obtained. So that's that again, of course, many Brexiters would dispute this, but most people who are interested in international relations, sorry, I just hesitated there because I was getting a message saying there's a problem with the connection, but I'll continue unless something else happens. The most people who are experts in international relations would see the Brexit as having marginalised the United Kingdom in terms of its international standing, because to most of our friends and allies, it simply seemed to be an inexplicable kind of policy. And of course, crucially, and this is on the record, that the Russian administration, the Putin administration, saw Brexit as having diminished the UK. In their eyes, a more divided nation was a weaker nation, that it was separated away, somewhat separated from its kind of allies. And certainly, even if Brexit in itself didn't perhaps necessarily need to mean that, the ways in which Brexit was done, I think, undeniably have reduced the moral authority of the United Kingdom in international relations. And by that I mean, in particular, the quite open sort of thing of saying, well, we're going to flout international law, whatever the phrase was at the time, in a limited and specific way, in relation to the clauses of the Internal Market Bill. Now, in fact, those clauses never actually made it into the Act, and so it didn't happen. But just the very suggestion inevitably makes it much more difficult for the United Kingdom to speak with moral authority about upholding international law when it itself has treated it in a cavalier kind of way. And again, with the unilateral extension of grace periods in the Northern Ireland Protocol, that the reputation of the UK with the EU, yes, but with the United States and more generally, is inevitably damaged by those kinds of things. And again, it's not a matter of sort of that being a Remainer kind of viewpoint, because Michael Howard, the former Tory leader, very kind of pro-Brexit, very forcefully at the time of the Internal Market Bill said, how will we be able to say to countries like Russia, and he named Russia, how will we be able to say to countries like Russia with any authority when they break international law, when we ourselves are saying that? So that now, I think, has come more into focus. The very fact of not being in the EU, one side of that is that Britain is able to have an independent sanctions policy, but the other side of the coin is that it makes coordination with the EU much more complicated. Now, there's been a lot of kind of discussion over the last few days about, or who's been quicker and who's been sort of harder in their sanctions, whether it's the EU or whether it's the United Kingdom. And I think, there's in a sense a slightly kind of side issues to my mind, in as much as you can say, and it's right to say that, for example, early on before the invasion, that the UK was more active in terms of providing arms and training in Ukraine than was the European Union, but then subsequently its initial sanctions were sort of a bit slower than the European Union's, and then the UK patch is beginning to sort of speed up again now. But this so much isn't the issue about whether people are sort of a few days earlier or a few days later doing certain kinds of things. It's the issue about making the coordination more complex than it would otherwise have been. This doesn't mean, often with Brexiters, they want to say, oh, so you're saying coordination is now impossible, just as they would say, oh, so you're saying we won't do any trade with the EU anymore. No, it's not about saying we won't do any trade. It's not about saying we won't have any cooperation. It's just about saying it's that much more difficult. And at the end of January, when Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, was travelling around to many European capitals, that wasn't, as presented by some, a sign of UK taking the lead. It was just showed that you had it was just showing how outside of the EU you had to coordinate with the EU in a different way and a less efficient way than was possible as a member of the EU. We could talk more about that and maybe will in questions. I think an issue here is that Brexit. Brexit is now really undeniable. No one seriously denies that Brexit has weakened the UK economy. And so, of course, sanctions are designed to hurt Russia, but they inevitably hurt the party putting the sanctions on. And so the UK, like the EU, like the US, will suffer itself by putting sanctions on Russia. And therefore, because our economy is weaker than it would have been, that is going to be harder for us to a harder cost for us to bear than it otherwise would have been. And I think a really kind of key thing, which is a drum that I had been banging for years, but I think becomes very, very obvious now in relation to Ukraine, is that all the time through the referendum and thereafter there was this idea from Brexiters, security is to do with NATO. The European Union is nothing to do with NATO. There's nothing to do with security, and that was absolutely, completely naive because of the level of interpenetration and connection and cooperation, the growing connection and cooperation that had been for several years between the European Union and NATO. And we shouldn't just think of this security in terms of sort of military and troops, but in terms of things like cybersecurity, where there's extensive cooperation, and of course also the fact that, as we can sort of see very clearly in relation to Ukraine, what NATO is able to do, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, is sort of quite limited militarily, and we see how actually security is an ensemble of the sort of the military and the diplomatic and the economic and the technological and so on, and taking the UK out again. It's not that taking the UK out of the EU removes completely. It's not. This is not kind of like an either or. It's just that it adds another layer to complexity at a time when what is needed is a simplicity and a unity of kind of response. And I think that perhaps this isn't something that just arose because of Brexit, but Brexit seems, the sort of post-Brexit period, really sort of seems to have led Britain, or the British government, the Johnson government, into this need, it seems, to constantly boast about leading in all kinds of spheres, world leading this, world leading that, and Johnson and others, and some Brexiters, Dan Hannan, I think today in the Sunday Telegraph, talked about Britain leading in this crisis. But that really doesn't sort of stack up. Britain has been involved, sure, but the idea that, for example, really key developments like the EU and Germany changing their policy on the direct delivery of arms to Ukraine. This isn't something which is a development that Britain has led. And I'm not saying this is some terrible thing. I mean, I think part of the actual problem with all this world leading thing is there is no particular reason or need why Britain needs to be the leader necessarily in these kinds of things. But the boasting about it is really problematic, particularly when the boasting comes in the form of as has happened throughout this crisis, and of course before, of sort of saying, of criticizing, particularly criticizing the Germans or the French or those in particular, for what they are or are not doing. And inevitably, if you do that, then your capacity to be an effective partner is diminished, because most countries, like most people, don't like being told, oh well, your contribution is useless, and we're leading you to do things in a better way. And I think related to that, we can see that the global Britain strategy, and particularly the way that it was articulated in the integrated review last year, is really, and several commentators have been saying this in the last couple of weeks. Peter Kellner in Carnegie Europe, Robert Shrimsley in Financial Times, and others. It really shows how flawed that was, and in particular, I think what was flawed about it is Johnson and others' view that this was about turning our back on regionalism. That it's part of the same. You see the same problem with the economics, that they seem to have got this idea that there's a conflict, that you can't be global if you're regional, and the problem is that actually regionality is a basis for being globally important in economics, but perhaps also in other kinds of areas. But certainly that Britain's security concerns with respect to Russia are absolutely bound up with the region, with the continent of Europe. And so things like sort of sending the carrier strike force to the Indo-Pacific is really just posturing and irrelevant to real security needs. So I think this is something which has become and will become more of the discussion as what happens in Ukraine develops and becomes digested. Brexit is a big part of their case, or one certainly part of their case for Brexit was the idea that the EU is too slow, that it's too disunited, they can't act effectively, and we shouldn't overstate it. I mean, but Ukraine has shown actually quite the opposite. Now that perhaps would not always be the case, that it's relatively easy because there's a high degree of unanimity about Ukraine and what should be done, and so that won't always sort of be the case. But certainly, it's acted at least as fast as, if not faster, than the UK. And then finally, I think that in a particular part of the UK response to the Ukraine crisis, that we can see that Brexit, or at least the kind of Brexity thing about immigration and refugees, has really impaired the UK response. And there we can see quite clearly that the UK response has been very, very unsatisfactory compared with that of the EU. That initially there was even just sort of saying, oh well, if they can get visas, they can come, and then there was a sort of, under constant pressure, a gradual kind of relaxation of who would be able to come. First, if they had parents, but not grandparents, and I think it was extended to grandparents, and very, very grudgingly. But now, even today, there are multiple stories coming from France about Ukrainian refugees being turned away at effectively at the border, and was at Calais, and that, I think, absolutely. I mean, bizarrely, public support for accepting refugees is much higher than one would expect, including amongst Leave voters. But I think that amongst the Brexit politicians, that the overhang of the referendum has been to, as I say, impair or to slow or to very much limit the UK's response. Despite, or perhaps because of all of that, I wonder if there aren't sort of certain kinds of grounds for hope, if we can talk for hope in such an awful kind of context. But I mean hope again in the very narrow sense of hope in relation to sort of Brexit and the UK debate about Brexit. In some sense, the Ukraine war, it kind of clarifies sides in the sense that there are sort of two sides. Whether that's between kind of Russia and the West, if we want to sort of say that. But actually, it's amazing how we've sort of seen in the last week or two this rush of people on the very sort of disparate set of people who one would kind of associate with the kind of alt-right of suddenly there are kind of anti-vaxxers lining up to support Putin, and a lot of the kind of libertarian people kind of not exactly supporting Putin necessarily, but kind of saying, well, there's two sides to this, and being very equivocal, I think, about extremely equivocal about the rights and wrongs of what is being done to Ukraine. So it kind of clarifies sides, and in clarifying sides, it also very much sort of clarifies the fact that the UK and the EU are on the same side, which I would guess perhaps many people on this call didn't particularly need a reminder of. But given what's happened in the last few years, that does seem to me potentially to have some positive implications. That perhaps just at the general level of improving the tone of relations. I mean, it's early days, and maybe this is, I think I said in the blog, I think maybe it's wishful thinking on my part. But I mean, for example, Liz Truss was invited to the European Council of Foreign Ministers of Foreign Affairs, which despite no longer being a member of the EU, as were her equivalents in the United States and Canada, and that does sort of, I think, speak to perhaps opening enhanced cooperation. There have been reports, people in the EU or officials in the EU saying how much easier it has been to deal with the UK over the Ukraine crisis than it had been sort of before. But then against that, when Liz Truss talked about that meeting, she pointedly didn't mention the fact that it had been with the EU and just talked about the G7 and NATO, and so so I'm not sure it's been necessarily the opportunities necessarily being taken, but I think the opportunities are there. That in the context of the shared concerns over Ukraine, perhaps the chances for agreement over the Northern Ireland Protocol are greater than they would have been. But again, against that, or maybe partly because of that, we've seen in the last couple of days, the last 48 hours, quite strong statements from particularly sort of Steve Baker, the former head of the European Research Group, sort of say, really trying to push the government hard to trigger Article 16. Now, I think it is perhaps partly because of that, and partly reflects the fact that those people realise or are seeing that the government is less willing to do that because of the Ukraine situation, and they're sort of concerned about that. But anyway, there's a possibility, I think, or a better possibility as a result of UK, that we may see some agreement there. There's a lot of people talking now about the need to link security and to cooperate more, not just about Ukraine, but more generally, to cooperate with the EU over security and defence. And don't forget, that was always really meant to be the idea. It was only really when Boris Johnson and David Frost took over negotiations that we ended up with this very, very, very thin set of agreements in relation to security and the trade and cooperation agreement. So perhaps we will see improvements on that. Perhaps rethinking global Britain to be more realistic about what Britain can be, and also about what its regional responsibilities are. I think there's some evidence in the polls that, well, there is definite evidence in opinion polls that Leave and Remain voters do not think so very differently about Ukraine crisis, and that's quite an important development, because in a lot of the political debates and divides since 2016, we can see them having been patterned via whether people Leave or Remain voters. That doesn't seem to be true, or nearly as true, in relation to the Ukraine crisis. And maybe there's even a sort of a sense I mean, I think it's too early to say that, but that somehow in the face of the Ukraine thing, it all just suddenly seems a bit sort of pointless, stupid. You know, why are we changing the law on this coming Monday in the economic crime bill, so that our sanctions, so that we can legally sanction Russian entities which are on the EU's list? You know, what then is so wonderful about this independence when in practice we are doing things in tandem, as indeed we are over quite a lot of regulatory things? And so I think maybe that's a possibility. But if it is, it will need, you know, it will need people who are pro-Brexit to recognise that. And potentially out of all this, we can move to a better path than we've been on. I won't go all through this. I don't think we've got time. But there's just one, the top sentence there, which is a quote from from my Brexit book, a quote from page 242 of the book. It says, the inescapable fact is that Brexit or no Brexit, the UK is inextricably linked to the rest of the continent by geography, history and economy. And I guess what I'm trying to say this evening is that the Ukraine crisis has really, I think, strongly underscored that fact. And given that it is a fact, and to the extent it is more strongly recognized as a fact, then other things can flow in terms of the kind of relationship that we have with the EU. So as with everything else in Brexit, this is still unfolding. And I've mentioned my blog, and if you want to keep on top of all the Brexit developments, there we are, Brexit and Beyond, which is, generally speaking, has a new post every Friday morning.